In 401 BCE, the Persian Empire stood on the edge of internal collapse. King Artaxerxes II faced a direct challenge not from a foreign enemy, but from his own younger brother, Cyrus the Younger. Ambitious, charismatic, and confident, Cyrus believed the throne belonged to him. To take it, he assembled a massive force of Greek mercenaries, roughly 14,000 men, and marched east. Artaxerxes responded with overwhelming numbers. His army may have exceeded 40,000 soldiers. The two forces met near the Euphrates River at a place known as Cunaxa. Militarily, the battle was uneven. Cyrus's troops fought hard, but numbers mattered. As the engagement turned against him, Cyrus made a desperate decision. Instead of retreating, he charged directly toward his brother's position, hoping that killing the king would instantly end the conflict. For a brief moment, it almost worked. Then a single javelin struck Cyrus. The blow was fatal. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately, and Artaxerxes secured his throne. History would record the name of the man who threw that javelin, Mithridates. At that moment, Mithridates was not a villain. He was not even particularly important. He was simply a soldier who had acted decisively in battle and altered the course of imperial history. And for that, he was rewarded. In the aftermath of Cunaxa, Mithridates was treated as a hero. Artaxerxes II had survived the greatest threat to his rule, and the man responsible for killing his rival was rewarded accordingly. Mithridates received gold, promotions, and public favor. His position rose. His future, at least on the surface, appeared secure. But there was a condition. Mithridates was never to speak of what he had done. The official version of events was simple and politically useful. Artaxerxes himself had struck down his brother. The king's legitimacy depended on this narrative. Power in the Persian court was not just held by force, but by image. To admit that a low-ranking soldier had ended the rebellion with a single throw would weaken that image. At first, Mithridates complied. Then came the celebration. During a feast held to mark the victory, surrounded by alcohol, music, and men eager to hear stories of battle, Mithridates made a mistake that would cost him his life. Drunk, emboldened, and perhaps proud, he openly declared that it was his javelin, not the king's hand, that had killed Cyrus the Younger. With that statement, the truth became a threat. Mithridates had not betrayed the empire. He had not plotted rebellion. He had not committed treason in the conventional sense. His crime was far more dangerous. He embarrassed the crown. By contradicting the king's narrative in public, he exposed Artaxerxes as a liar. In a court built on authority and perception, this could not be tolerated. There would be no trial. There would be no public defense. The punishment was decided swiftly. Mithridates was sentenced to death by scaphism. At first glance, scaphism does not sound especially terrifying. Ancient sources describe a procedure that seems almost restrained when compared to executions involving blades, fire, or immediate violence. There is no cutting, no beating, no dramatic moment of death. The method begins with two small boats, or hollowed wooden troughs. The condemned man is placed inside the lower one. His body lies flat on his back, his head, hands, and feet are left exposed, protruding from the sides. A second boat of equal size is then placed on top, enclosing his torso and pinning him in place. Once secured, the victim cannot move. There is no room to turn, no way to shift position, no possibility of escape. At this stage, the punishment still appears deceptively mild. The man is not being injured, he is not being deprived of food or water. In fact, quite the opposite. He is fed. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the condemned is forced to consume a mixture of milk and honey. If he refuses, his mouth is pried open and the food is poured down his throat. To make matters stranger, the same mixture is then smeared over his exposed face, hands, and feet. Milk and honey. Two substances associated with nourishment, comfort, even luxury. Some later writers would go so far as to call this punishment death by milk and honey, a phrase that almost sounds benign, even appealing if stripped of its context. But this initial impression is exactly the point. Scaphism was designed to mislead the senses, both of the victim and of anyone hearing about it. The suffering does not begin with pain. It begins with survival. And that is what makes everything that follows far worse. The true cruelty of scaphism lies in a simple decision. The victim is not allowed to die. Milk and honey are not chosen at random. They are rich, calorie-dense foods. In small amounts, they can sustain a human body for an extended period of time. In large amounts, especially when force-fed, they overwhelm it. Day after day, Mithridates was fed this mixture. When his body resisted, it was forced. When he vomited, he was fed again. When his stomach rebelled, the process continued. Ancient sources describe how the victim's belly began to swell, distended by constant intake. The body, unable to properly digest such quantities, responded with nausea and severe diarrhea. This was not an accident. It was a feature of the punishment. Under normal circumstances, starvation or dehydration would bring death relatively quickly. Scaphism prevents both. The victim remains hydrated. He remains nourished. His organs continue to function badly, but enough. In effect, the punishment hijacks the body's own survival mechanisms. Mithridates was kept alive not because his life mattered, but because his suffering required time. The goal was never execution in the traditional sense. It was endurance, prolongation, delay. The longer the body resisted, the more complete the punishment became. And while this process unfolded inside him, something else was beginning to happen on the outside. Once Mithridates had been force-fed, the same mixture of milk and honey was poured over his exposed skin. His face, his hands, his feet. In the heat of the Persian sun, this coating did not remain liquid for long. It thickened, dried, and clung to the skin, turning the exposed parts of his body into a powerful attractant. Insects arrived almost immediately. Flies were the first. Drawn by sweetness, moisture, and warmth, they settled on his face and limbs in dense numbers. Wasps and bees followed, stinging exposed skin repeatedly. Mosquitoes fed freely, undisturbed by any attempt to swat them away. Mithridates could not move. He could not brush them aside. He could not roll away. He could not escape the constant contact. Ancient chroniclers describe this phase not as a moment of sudden agony, but as an unrelenting, daily torment. Every feeding was followed by renewed exposure. Every morning brought a fresh layer of sweetness, and every afternoon brought more insects. The skin, already irritated by heat and stings, began to break down. Small wounds opened. Areas of raw flesh formed where insects had fed repeatedly. This was not yet the worst part of the punishment, but it marked a critical transition. Mithridates' body was no longer simply restrained. It had become a food source. And while his exposed skin attracted what fed from the outside, something far more dangerous was developing inside the boats themselves. While insects tormented Mithridates from the outside, a far more destructive process was unfolding beneath the upper boat. Pinned in place and unable to move, his body had nowhere to expel its waste. The constant intake of milk and honey, combined with severe diarrhea, meant that excrement and urine accumulated inside the enclosed space. The boats became a sealed chamber. There was no drainage, no airflow, no relief from heat. Under the Persian sun, the interior rapidly transformed into something closer to a septic pit than a place of confinement. The mixture of bodily waste, spilled food, sweat, and heat created ideal conditions for rapid decay. Ancient sources describe how this filth began to ferment. The air grew thick and foul. The victim lay submerged in his own waste, unable to lift himself away from it, unable to even shift position. This environment did more than cause discomfort. It accelerated breakdown. The skin softened from constant moisture. Small wounds, already formed by insect bites, were now exposed to bacteria. The body's natural defenses weakened as infection set in. Swelling increased. The abdomen distended further, bloated by both food and internal gases. At this stage, Mithridates was no longer merely being punished. He was being prepared. The chamber inside the boats had become a breeding ground not just for rot, but for life of a very different kind. And once that life appeared, the punishment entered its final and most irreversible phase. Once the conditions inside the boats reached this stage, death no longer depended on human action. Nature took over. The stench of waste, sweat, and decaying tissue attracted flesh flies and blowflies. These insects are drawn to exactly the kind of environment the boats had become. Warm, moist, and rich in organic material. They laid their eggs, not just on the waste pulled beneath Mithridates' body, but in open wounds, softened skin, and any exposed orifice they could reach. Within a short time, those eggs hatched into maggots. Modern forensic science helps clarify what ancient writers could only describe vaguely. In the right conditions, maggots can consume soft tissue with remarkable speed. They do not wait for death, they feed on living flesh, burrowing into muscle and spreading through damaged skin. Inside the boats, there was nothing to stop them. Mithridates could not move. He could not brush them away. He could not even see most of what was happening to him. As the infestation spread, bacteria flourished. Infection followed. Internal tissues broke down. Gases built up, causing further swelling. The body began to lose structural integrity, turning from organized tissue into something far less defined. This was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow conversion from a living body into a decaying ecosystem. Ants and beetles were likely drawn in as well, entering through cracks, wounds, and natural openings. Each species played its role. Flesh was consumed, cartilage softened, organs began to liquefy under the combined effects of infection and heat. At this point, Mithridates was no longer being killed by his sentence in the traditional sense. He was being processed by the environment his punishment had created. And yet, despite all of this, death still did not come quickly. That final moment would arrive only after the body had been reduced beyond recovery, when survival itself was no longer biologically possible. By the final days, Mithridates' body was no longer functioning as a coherent whole. What remained inside the boats was a system under total biological failure. Infection had spread unchecked. Tissue breakdown was no longer localized. The boundary between living flesh and decaying matter had effectively collapsed. Ancient writers described this phase with disturbing restraint. When the upper boat was eventually removed, they did not speak of wounds or injuries in the conventional sense. They spoke of absence, flesh consumed, cavities filled with vermin, and organs no longer intact. Modern understanding fills in what those sources could not explain. Sepsis would have been inevitable. Bacteria entering the bloodstream trigger systemic inflammation, organ shutdown, and eventually cardiovascular collapse. Combined with dehydration from constant diarrhea, heat stress, and massive infection, the body would have lost the ability to regulate itself. Death, when it finally arrived, did not come as a sudden release. There was no decisive moment, no final strike, no clear boundary between life and death. It came only when the body could no longer sustain even the most basic processes. When circulation failed, when the organs, already liquefied and compromised, ceased to function entirely. After 17 days, Mithridates was dead. Not executed in the traditional sense, not killed by a blade or by human hands, but reduced, step by step, until life simply could not continue. And yet, even after this prolonged destruction, one question remains, one that shifts this story from horror into something far more unsettling. As horrifying as scaphism sounds, there is a problem that cannot be ignored. We do not know for certain if it ever happened. Every detailed account of Mithridates' death comes from Greek writers, not Persian records. The most frequently cited source, Plutarch, was writing roughly 4 to 5 centuries after the events he describes. He never witnessed scaphism himself. He relied on earlier texts, many of which no longer exist. Another source, Zonaros, appears to draw from historians who were openly hostile to Persia and known for exaggeration. Painting the Persian court as uniquely cruel served a political and cultural purpose. It reinforced the idea of Greek moral superiority over so-called Eastern despotism. There is also a complete lack of physical evidence, no archaeological remains, no carvings, no inscriptions, no Persian legal text describing the punishment. This absence is striking, especially when compared to other brutal practices of the ancient world. The Persians did not shy away from recording executions. We know about crucifixions, impalements, and mass killings because they were documented. If scaphism truly existed in the form described, it would have been a spectacle, and spectacles tend to leave traces. There is another possibility. The word scaphism itself comes from the Greek scaphe, meaning trough or boat. And Greece already had a punishment disturbingly similar in principle: siphonism. Victims were tied, covered in honey, and left to insects. Sometimes they were removed and killed later. Sometimes they were left to rot. It raises an uncomfortable question. Was scaphism a real Persian execution? Or was it a Greek exaggeration, a familiar punishment pushed to its most extreme form and projected onto a hated enemy? We may never know. But the uncertainty does not weaken the story. In some ways, it makes it more disturbing. Because whether scaphism was real or not, it reveals something very real about how history is written and how horror can be amplified, reshaped, and preserved long after the truth has rotted away. Whether scaphism truly occurred exactly as described may remain unresolved, but that uncertainty does not make the story meaningless. In fact, it sharpens its purpose. At its core, this is not just a tale about a grotesque execution. It is a story about power, and how power responds when its image is threatened. Mithridates did not die because he rebelled. He did not die because he failed his king. He died because he spoke a truth that contradicted authority. Scaphism, real or imagined, represents an idea rather than a method. The idea that punishment does not need violence to be absolute. That suffering can be outsourced to time, to biology, to the environment, while those responsible remain distant, untouched, and blameless. It also reveals something uncomfortable about history itself. Stories survive not because they are accurate, but because they are useful. The Greeks may have exaggerated scaphism to portray Persia as monstrous, or they may have preserved a real event because it perfectly embodied their fears of unchecked monarchy. Either way, the image endured, and that endurance matters. Because when we hear this story today, the question is no longer simply whether it happened. The question becomes why we continue to tell it. Why a tale of prolonged suffering, stripped of spectacle and heroism, still captures attention more than any battlefield victory. Perhaps it is because scaphism forces us to confront a quiet truth, that the most terrifying punishments are not always the ones that kill quickly. They are the ones that keep life going, long after dignity, agency, and hope have been removed. And whether scaphism was carved into history by Persian hands or shaped by Greek pens, the horror it represents remains real not as an execution, but as a warning about what power is capable of when no one is allowed to contradict it.